Welcome to April Financial Lawyers Conference program. I am 2022 Financial Lawyers Conference President, and I'm here joined by our Vice President, JP Fritz. If you were not able to attend a couple of FLC announcements, but you missed a phenomenal annual seminar program at Torrey Pines, I'm sorry that everybody wasn't able to come this year, but hopefully you'll be able to come next year. Our visiting professor this year was Jared Elias. We were joined by judges Marty Barish and Judge Scott Clarkson. And I think we all had a very spirited, informative, entertaining debate. I was pleased to see this year. We had, I think, one of the largest classes of rookie participants that I can remember. I hope that continues in the future. I just want to give a round of thanks again to JP Fritz for doing a really phenomenal job this year. And we should also mention Bo Bollinger, who originally actually planned the program 3 years ago. And so it was nice to see it finally come together after COVID. And I want to recognize our stellar administrator, Leslie Medina, who's on, who coordinated and produced her first annual seminar, and it really went off without a hitch. Again, round of congratulations to everybody in front of the larger membership here. After this evening, we just have two more capstone programs for the year. We have the Jeffrey Turner Memorial Commercial Law Update Program, and then the George Treaster Memorial Bankruptcy Law Update Program. You should come to all the Financial Lawyers Conference programs, but certainly those two are phenomenal programs. As with all of our programs, a lot of work goes into them. And so I hope you'll attend, spread the word. And I'd like to encourage everybody to take some time over the coming months to consider how you can become more involved and contribute to keep Financial Lawyers Conference growing. Our board nominations are coming up in June. If you want to volunteer to serve on the Board of Governors, please let me know, or JP or Leslie. Let anybody know, and they'll pass it on to us. But we are always looking for talented people that want to give, and so that's important. As well, you can volunteer to provide an education program for the membership. I do get a lot of volunteers next year. JP will be in charge of sort of making sure the panels go off. But it's great to get as many volunteers as we can, and we'll try to bring the membership the best panels possible. And then finally, encouraging others to join in the organization. Rick Wynn has graciously agreed this year to lead a membership committee, and he's begun work already on a program that's going to help target students, clerks, and new associates in law firms. If you can assist Rick in this effort, please let either Rick Wynn or myself know, and we'll get you dialed in, or let Leslie know, and we'll get you dialed in for that effort. JP, did you have any announcements in particular that you wanted to make before we go to the panel?
No, Scott, you did a great job in covering it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program on ethics, governance, and best practices in cases of fraud. Our two member participants, we had three. Tom couldn't make it because of some, Van, what's the right way to say it? He's involved in a case and didn't want to be discussing these issues for fear that he might say something that might be later used against him. But exactly our two member participants on this month's panel actively participated in this year's annual seminar, and they share our passion for advancing the academic discourse in our community. First, I have Van Durr. It's my pleasure to introduce Van. I'm sure everybody knows Van, practices at Skadden. He's been practicing for almost 30 years and specializes in troubled company M&A, financings, restructuring transactions, out of court, formal insolvency proceedings. From his perch, leading Skadden's corporate restructuring practice on the West Coast and also working in the Pacific Rim. I think you all know Van has led legal teams on many of the most prominent cases, too many to number, and covering industries that include retail, financial industries, gaming, entertainment, and the list goes on. Certainly, Van, it's a pleasure to have you and your experience here today. As well, most, if not all of you, probably know Seth Freeman, who's now with B. Riley Financial Services. Seth is an accomplished restructuring consultant, crisis turnaround manager, has over 30 years experience, and again has handled all facets of corporate restructuring and all sorts of corporate fiduciary roles. He holds an MBA in international management. He has extensive experience in various industries as well: retail, venture capital, technology, agriculture, just to name a few. Seth, I was looking at your bio, and I didn't know this about you previously, but he has extensive experience in cross-border in emerging markets, and you've developed an expertise in the EB-5 immigration program, including advising foreign investors and their advisors on fraud and compliance issues. Van, why don't I turn the program over to you to introduce our guest and third panelist for today?
Will do. Thanks, Scott and JP, and also thanks everybody for joining. It looks like we do have a nice a bit of participation. We're grateful for that. Thanks for taking time in the afternoon on a Monday. Our last panelist was our independent director in the DC Solar situation. I was counsel. Seth was our chief restructuring officer. Wyatt Wachtel hails from San Diego, although it appears that he is on Central Park South at the moment. Anyway, Wyatt has been a private equity investor for over 20 years with a particular bias towards distress transactions. We met a number of years ago on an energy deal. It was natural that I reach out to him for this deal, which touches sustainable energy, but little did we know that it touched a lot more. So we're actually delighted to have Wyatt here from the perspective of an actual decision maker. We'd also hoped, as Scott mentioned, to have one of the investors, really the largest creditor in the deal, to get their perspective, but there is litigation that's ongoing in DC Solar. And so out of an abundance of caution, our investor representative thought it was best to take a pass, but we'll do our best to cover that angle as we go forward. If we can advance the slides to the agenda. So here's what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A, and I'll try to do my best to keep an eye on the chat as well. If people want to raise their hand or ask questions as we go along, we'll do our best to be responsive to that. We're not going to go through the presentation slide by slide, but it is important that we give you some of the background to understand some of the dynamics and what we as the core fiduciary team was trying to accomplish, and why we candidly why we didn't just hang it up as soon as we discovered the fraud. But you can go ahead and advance the slide again, please. Obviously, we all are involved in situations where we're talking about fiduciary duties, we're talking about ethics, and applying them in a real world situation. It's wonderful to sort of walk through the rules and give everybody an update, but we thought that this was a sort of a unique opportunity to actually talk to you about a real world situation where we were, literally stumbled upon a fraud unknowingly, and how do we navigate that? And I think hopefully you'll get, again, the unique perspectives of the financial advisor, a decision maker, and counsel to give you different elements of that and see how we dealt with it. Again, we'd love to get your questions and views as well. You can go ahead and advance the slide. So, and I asked Seth sort of to chime in here as well. So this situation, which grabbed headlines, some of the headlines are, the couple that duped Berkshire Hathaway out of, billions. But late last fall, the CEO of our client, Jeff Karpoff, he was the CEO of DC Solar, was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison for a roughly $1 billion Ponzi scheme. Depends on how you do the math, but clearly the largest in Northern California history. The key to the fraud, and we'll pause a little bit on another slide in a moment, but what Jeff was peddling was really tax credits in a specific area, solar energy. There was a very specific government program that allowed for very attractive, I'll say, tax credits. So Jeff's clients, in effect, and investors were, a who's who of blue chip insurance companies and banks in the United States, and they literally invested hundreds of millions of dollars across 35 separate funds that were set up over a 7-8 year period. The house of cards began to fall when the government raided Jeff's home, various businesses that were unrelated to DC Solar, as well as DC Solar, seized literally hundreds of millions of dollars in cash and property. And that's when we had been advising DC Solar with respect to its tax issues, that actually was undergoing an IRS tax audit, which we were successful in settling in October of this time frame. And then it was December when the government, this is a classic example of two arms of the government not talking to each other. But the government raided the business and his home that December. And that's when Jeff came back to us and said, look, I don't know what's going on. And we had just engaged in a multi-million-dollar settlement of a quite large tax liability with the IRS, and had no reason to believe that the emperor had no clothes. As the slide points out, a handful of Jeff's cohorts, including his wife and others, have all pled guilty and been sentenced to sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. It seems like 15 years seems to be the bellwether for most of the people that were directly involved. You can go ahead and advance the slide.
I wanted to point out that the raid was very comprehensive. The raid not just removed the company's server, but it also removed about 600 bankers' boxes of physical documents. And so one of the what stimulated trying to do something with this business was actually the return of the server. And because the company was basically disabled as soon as the server was taken. And it was took the government about 3 weeks to actually return the server. And then the other important point is when we started as advisors and needed to prepare 10 Chapter 11 filings in a very short period of time, we did that without the aid of any physical documents whatsoever. It was almost like a forensic investigation just to get the petitions done, and to make sure the mailing matrices were all correct. So it was like having both hands tied behind our back. And point out really quickly is a disclaimer. So B. Riley is the financial advisor to the Chapter 7 trustee, and it is a case that I continue to work on. And I just wanted to be clear that my comments today do not represent the Chapter 7 trustee.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, it was really a unique situation, and we, likewise asked Wyatt to parachute in on no notice and with no knowledge. And one thing that you have to take into account as we talk about this is the fraudster and his wife. Neither one of them had a college degree. They created this entity and created this fraud, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, but it remains unclear to all of us to this day when the business changed from a real business to a fraud, and we'll come back to that. Little spoiler alert there. But what was truly remarkable to all of us, and why you might want to speak to this, is Jeff and Paulette voluntarily gave up control of their business to people that they had only met for a handful of days. And that includes me. I had met with them going on 6 weeks. Wyatt and Seth came to know them literally days before we ultimately filed the Chapter 11, and they voluntarily turned over control of the Chapter 11 to Seth as CRO and to Wyatt and Bill Keenan as independent directors. Knowing that it was a fraud, which they obviously, Jeff is at Club Fed for the next 3 decades, but knowing that we were going to figure this out, it was remarkable, at least to me, that he was willing to turn over that kind of control. Wyatt, did you have a comment there, or what was your perspective?
Yeah, I actually was quite surprised because we actually did not meet in person at all. We actually had a phone conversation. This was before Zoom, so I didn't even get to see his face. And so it was over a phone call, and he asked some questions about what we thought we could do, but it was more of a spitball in terms of, all right, here are some things how we can generate some revenues, because as Van will discuss, these vehicles will by and large not generating any revenues. So we were trying to quickly figure out ways to put in money or inject some money into this and turn it into a business, because most of the investors at this point in time weren't looking at these assets, as Van alluded to earlier. They weren't looking at them as pure cash flow assets. There was a tax element to it. The other thing was quite surprising was the tax, the complexity of the tax issues, and how that influenced their decision. And we, to this day, I still don't know whether they fully understood what was going on with the tax aspects of it, how they were fully structured, because there, as Seth can attest to, there are law firms and accounting firms that have full groups dedicated to figuring out how to navigate this tax asset. And for two people who didn't have any real business education, whereas they started their business as nothing wrong with it, but they were mechanics, and suddenly they're in the world of esoteric tax, and facing the likes of Berkshire and other people like that. So it was a lot of in my mind, I said, look, if they can figure this out, then there's something here. Not until later on did we find out here was a very thin word. So
yeah, so let's take a couple minutes, and then I just want to talk about how the model worked, because it is important to the story, and it's important to how the Karpoffs were able to keep the fraud secret. So the way this worked, and it's very important, and why don't we go, Leslie or whoever's controlling the slides, why don't we go to that separate slide about in Appendix A?
The diagram?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that will really support
Give me 1 second.
the explanation.
Yeah, no problem. So the way this worked, so DC Solar, while we pull up the slide, I'll start to explain it.
17.
DC Solar actually partnered with the various investor groups. So what DC Solar did was they made mobile solar generators, and we'll show you some, we got some fancy pictures in the back that you can see, but basically these were designed to provide a mobile source of ready energy for a variety of potential uses. On college campuses, they're utilized, people can charge their phones. If they're running across campus, they want to recharge a tablet or a laptop computer, they can use it for that purpose. They've used for mobile lighting, for events, things of that nature. And the way that the partnership, each fund was structured, is that the third-party investor, Geico, Progressive, East West Bank, you name it, would contribute $50,000 in cash per MSG, and there might be 50 or 100 in a particular fund. Then the DC Solar would take a note for $100,000 per MSG for a total purchase price for each MSG of $150,000. During the tax recapture period, there we go. Thank you. During the tax recapture period, the investor owned the majority of the fund and would get, say 98% of the tax credit benefit. At the end of the tax recapture period, typically 5 years, the partnership would flip so that the investor would have a small minority stake in the fund, and then DC Solar would have the majority stake in the fund. And so in that way, the investor never really had to worry about the payment of the note because it got all the benefit of that tax credit right up front. And so when Wyatt says that the decision-making was driven almost entirely by the tax credit, that's true. So, well, what kind of due diligence did these folks do? Well, they had a valuation report that was prepared by Alvarez and Marcel, accredited, analyst of value. You have Nixon Peabody, a national law firm, giving a tax opinion. And you had a guy certifying that he had inspected every single unit. Now, 17,000 units is what DC Solar should have had in place based upon the number of funds that invested and based upon the certifications that were given. We could only, and when I say we, I mean Seth, we could only ever find about 7,000 units. So DC Solar made 7,000 units. And what continues to really intrigue us, even to this day again, is what was the day when Jeff and Paulette woke up and decided, I don't think we have to actually make the things anymore. We can just keep raising money, and as long as the music never stops, everybody's happy. The investor gets their tax credit. We get to live this lavish lifestyle where we can have, Pitbull perform at our holiday party. And we never actually have to make another MSG. We never discovered what that moment was. I don't know that the government discovered what that moment was. The balance of the structure, just to finish out the thought, is that the fund would then lease the units to another DC Solar entity, DC Solar Distribution. DC Solar's distribution was to put these things out in the field. DC Solar Solutions did a fabulous job of raising the tax equity, and for 7,000 units worth, did a decent job of making MSGs. DC Solar Distribution did a horrible job of putting these units in the field. But Jeff utilized DC Solar Distribution as a way to further the Ponzi scheme. And this is probably the first element of the emperor having no clothes that we started to figure out. There was a smoking gun moment, which Seth will talk to in a few moments. But the first element that we said, is there really a business here, came in sort of two parts. One, the head of DC Solar's distributions, his resume was as an event host and coordinator in Las Vegas. In other words, he handled big VIPs going to Vegas to spend lots of money. That was his credential for deploying mobile solar generators. So that was sort of red flag number one. Red flag number two was that there was sort of a back-to-back relationship. One of the most successful ways, I would say, that DC Solar was able to put its units in service was in NASCAR events. They attached light panels to these things, put them in difficult to reach corners of arenas and tracks, and they worked. They worked really well. They shone lights on these events. It was very popular. The problem was that they actually didn't get rent. On paper, they got rent for the unit, but then DC Solar in turn had to sponsor NASCAR. Now, how did this further the Ponzi scheme? Well, the way it worked is Jeff would take these middle managers at Progressive, Geico, East West Bank, and entertain them at NASCAR events. They actually got to wave, the checkered flag. They got the big VIP box. And so, he took them to these elaborate events. So they not only did they love the fact that they took to their senior folks, a great tax equity investment to shield, income from these blue chip companies, but they got to hang out, at these cool parties at NASCAR events. So that was sort of from Jeff's perspective of perpetuating the fraud, it was sort of a win-win. It's when we, started. Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I want to jump in there about that point and go back for a moment to the diagram too. Yeah, we all read about affinity fraud, where people who are maybe in your same faith or your same social group and so forth, don't ask too many questions because you trust them. And Karpov was very clever in becoming a big NASCAR sponsor. And he started sponsoring teams, sponsoring major races. And it's very important because both Progressive Insurance and Geico are also huge NASCAR sponsors. So he very, in relative terms, because this thing only really went on for about 7 years, but in the most grandest way in the final 3, he was really part of the group because he was sponsoring the same things that these giant institutions were sponsoring. But it's important to look at this structure for a moment. A key element is that each of the entities, the Solar Eclipse Fund, DC Solar Solutions, and DC Solar Distribution were all controlled by Karpov or his nominee. And and these were all single investor funds. And to be clear, grandma and grandpa and auntie were not the investors. These were major corporations. And for a reason that we are still trying to understand, along with these others that Dan has raised, is how is it that Geico or Progressive or Sherwin-Williams or some of the other investors or banks would invest in a single investor fund where the managing member is also the sponsor, the manufacturer of the units, and the operator of the master lessee. They put all the eggs basically in one basket. And as the business evolved, Karpov realized he needed to have some other managing members because it was just becoming too much for one person to be involved with. And so he basically found people he could control to be, in essence, nominees for him. But because he was the sole managing member or the CEO of these major pieces of the operating parts of this business, he controlled the bank accounts, he controlled contracts between the entities and so forth. And that's how money could be moved around with very little oversight or involvement of the investors. And I also want to point out this red, the fraud was enabled because essentially you can see to the right of the Solar Eclipse Fund box, it says payments or note payments. The note payments would go from the fund to DC Solar Solutions to reduce the note that Van said that Solutions would carry back, rather than income from third-party lessors and renters going into DC Solar Distribution to fund the master lease payments that distribution was supposed to pay the funds. He was just basically recirculating the investor's money. And that's what this red arrow stands for. He was just basically moving money from the note payments from DC Solar Solutions into distribution to make it appear that lease money was being generated. In reality, barely 5% of really over $500 million of transfers came from third-party lessees. Sorry.
There was a question that came up, and I noticed about, was this transaction structure okay if this had generated revenues? And I think, you know, there's very well trodden path on how solar deals are structured and how tax equity is structured, and having those tax opinions. And so I think one of the aspects when you look at this structure that's non-traditional was that DC Solar Solutions, where they carry take back note and the solar solutions. So if they were generating revenues and they were basically deemed to be legitimate in the IRS's eyes, my guess is that it probably would have passed muster. The problem is that they didn't generate any revenue. As a matter of fact, zero revenues in most cases. The other issue is that eventually the IRS would have caught up with them under the fact that most of these units, they didn't have sufficient technology installed in them. And so most of the time they were running them with, there's a gas generator typically on these, and they were using the gas generator and not the solar. Eventually that would have probably come out, and is probably one of the reasons why people weren't using them, because of the fumes and things like that, and it kind of defeated the purpose. That was one aspect of maybe why they didn't use them and rent them. But so it's questionable whether over a longer period of time the structure would have worked given that nature. But if there's cash flows, it certainly would have elongated the entire scheme. Definitely elongated the entire scheme.
At the beginning, they when they had a smaller number, they were successful in renting them and leasing them. At the beginning of the company's business, cell towers were going up all over the country, and cell towers require power, both for testing and for a period of time before the local utility can hook into them. And they did a lot of business with the major mobile companies at the beginning. And as we'll get into, though, they did a much better job at selling them than renting them. And that was really the key problem.
Ironically, I've seen similar types of units in the market, but at a much more efficient, it looks to be a much more efficient in terms of solar panels, how they're constructed with batteries and things like that. So the question is, you know, were the Karpoffs ahead of their time? And when we first saw this, we said, okay, maybe, you know, there's something here. Fast forward now, you do start to see these things, more and more vehicles like that are pure solar without the gas generator, but not obviously in the scale in which the Karpoffs were talking about. And if for those of you on the West Coast that ever drive to Vegas, you actually can still see some of these units. If you go to the Terribles in Jean, Las Vegas, there's still 3 or 4 of them sitting in their parking lot, so you can actually see what they look like and the amount of use they get. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. The mobile generators were basically just a patchwork of, you know, off-the-shelf parts. And one of the ironies is that you could burn the charge on a particular MSG very quickly, but then it would take literally days of sunlight to recharge the unit. And so they literally had someone who would go out in the dead of night to refill the diesel tank. You know, think of you know, buying a hybrid vehicle thinking that you're doing something good for the environment, but the electric part just doesn't work at all. So you're constantly having to fill it with gas. That was the situation that they were confronting. And to put a finer point on Wyatt's remarks, and thanks David Meadows for the great question. There's a strong legal argument that the term that the IRS regs use is put in service. And as a casual observer, you would think, oh, someone's actually using the unit. The legal argument, however, is that the lease from the fund to DC Solar Distribution in the first instance was sufficient putting in service for the unit for the investor to get the tax credit, whether or not the MSG ever actually saw sunshine. So that was part of this as well. So going back to the story here, and you know, this is sort of our first you know, best practices moment, I guess. As we dug in after the raid, the path of least resistance was to get access to the company's books and records and some cash in order to prevent harm to the investors, right? Their tax credits were in jeopardy by the government shutting down. We also had employees that were out of work in the holiday season. And so, as restructuring professionals, we were just trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in whatever means we could. Step one was negotiate with the government. And that was the first call I got from my white collar partner was, hey, can you help us put together some kind of a consensual receivership so that the government can get comfortable that there's adult supervision and that, assuming that the fraud that they were alleging was indeed accurate, that there would be no further shenanigans while we go about protecting the same victims that the government's trying to protect. And the challenge that we faced was that the government was only willing to be so candid. I think they also had a suspicion that we were, in essence, sleeping with the enemy, and that theme will come up again later. We obviously weren't. We didn't have a clue of what was going on in reality. We were just looking to maximize value. And again, you'll hear as we go forward that everything we did was designed to maximize and preserve value. And ultimately, it didn't matter, even if the fraud was true, as it turned out to be, that really didn't change any of what we did. We would have taken all the same steps, even if we had known this on day one. And you can advance the slide now. We did, by the way, I should highlight, when we made it clear to the Karpoffs when we pursued Chapter 11 as an alternative to just cooperation with the government, we still told the Karpoffs, look, for this to work, you're going to have to step back, right? A Chapter 11 cannot be led efficiently by someone who's accused of the crimes that you're accused of. Sort of guilty till proven innocent kind of concept. And so we made it clear to them that we would only participate if Seth had full control as CRO of the day-to-day operations, and independent directors like Wyatt and Bill Keenan had decision-making power at the board level. The Karpoffs were just sort of along for the ride at that point. And again, for reasons that I'm actually, we can all pat each other on the back for the Karpoffs trusting us, but it was a bit of a head scratcher given that what they obviously knew at the time. We did have a question, which I will take. Actually, I thought I saw another question. Oh, here we go. There's a question in the chat and a question in the Q&A. So our client, just to be clear, was DC Solar. Seth's client was DC Solar. My client was DC Solar. One of the challenges that we had, and this is revealed here, is that the reason why there were 10 Chapter 11 cases is that the Karpoffs, with their ill-gotten gains, had bought a whole bunch of toys. And some of those toys involved some pretty nice properties in and around Nevada and Northern California. Most of those, if not all of those properties, there were also some properties in Mexico, as I recall. Mm-hmm. Most, if not all, those properties were owned by single-purpose LLCs. And as we get further along, we'll explain that we actually, by filing all of those entities together, the idea was that we would use the properties as collateral to get DC Solar some financing to continue its operations. That was the idea that we came up with. Let me just look at this other question. The question is, how do we get to the analysis of the Chapter 11? And that's great segue, because that's where we are. Without the government's cooperation, we thought that a transparent Chapter 11 was the best way to get financing into the company, and or convince the government that we were serious when we said to them pre-petition that we were willing to have third-party, completely transparent supervision and the Karpoffs stepping back from the day-to-day operations, we thought that they would actually accept willingly the Chapter 11. In that regard, we were completely wrong. I think there's another raised hand.
I opened up his microphone.
Great.
David,
Is there a question?
David Meadows? You're welcome to speak.
It's a limited time offer, David.
Going, gone.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that. Let me see. So, I've had this happen before. All right, David has withdrawn his hand. You can go ahead and advance the slide. So, Seth, why don't you discuss sort of the top 3 priorities from your perspective, and then what you did when you arrived on the scene, and I'll even give you the opportunity to talk about your famous smoking gun.
Sure. I think it's important to let people know that the properties in the portfolio were all free and clear, except basically the office building. And so we had a tremendous amount of real estate collateral to provide, and we were pretty realistic. We created a budget with the idea of actually trying to restart this company because we had no shortage of hardware to rent. We just needed to figure out how to get it in place and start generating revenue. And Van and I went through, I think, given the time constraints and the cloud of having just had a multi-agency government raid on the facilities, we actually had a pretty robust and competitive DIP loan procedure. And we actually got pretty good terms. We had quite a few participants willing to do this. But the focus that we had was number one, because we understood that the rationale for the investors in coming into this deal was their tax benefits. And to do that, we knew we needed to try to get those MSGs into service and to demonstrate that there was a real business here and generate some revenue. So that was the overarching issue initially, was to find some working capital to operate this while we figured out what to do next. Then the other part of it was to understand where we were with this business. And one of the key concerns was identifying where the MSGs are, because early on we requested a list of these thousands and thousands of MSGs and where they were located so we could try to rent them. And unfortunately, the chief operating officer at the time, who had been, all the staff there had already been terminated as a result of the raid, really was having a tough time giving us a detailed list. The other part of it was, the other priority was to try to find an exit for this, so we could, in fact, generate a return, a recovery in one form or the other for the investors. DC Solar had very few trade creditors, I want to point out. So there weren't very many general unsecured creditors. It was basically the investors in each of the single funds.
Yeah, one of the other red flags before we get to Seth's smoking gun, and it is that, as you would expect, the MSGs were supposed to have GPS locators, and there was a fancy box of German GPS locators in the offices that Seth uncovered, and Seth said, "Well, why aren't these GPS locators actually on MSGs?" And the answer we got was, "Oh, we were just in the process of converting from the old GPS to the new GPS. And so, and then the raid happened. The raid became an excuse for a lot of things, but that was one of the excuses. But the challenge that we had as we discovered these things, and this goes back to the best practices and the ethics and the fiduciary duty angle. As we learn more, we had to tread lightly because we did owe, a duty to the client to protect their confidences, and we started to learn things that were a little disturbing until the smoking gun, which we revealed within hours, if not days. But the decision that we made, and why you might want to speak to this is, and Seth has already commented a little bit about this, is ultimately we were pursuing a strategy, get DC Solar back up and running, deploy the MSGs in a way that generates revenue. That was all designed to protect the multi-billion dollars worth of investors that had actually written checks to the company, to the solar eclipse funds that in turn passed the money on to the company to get their tax credit. And so we were guided consistently by that principle that as long as we were taking action and making decisions that furthered that goal, that we were on well-trodden ground from a fiduciary duty perspective. And then ultimately, when we discovered that there was a fraud, we went completely open kimono with the investors, gave them a full report, and then gave them multiple alternatives that are described later in the deck to basically extricate themselves from this situation. Ultimately, they preferred a Chapter 7 trustee, because absent their participation in one of those few alternatives that we presented to them, we had no choice. We couldn't work for free. We had no choice but to convert the case and basically turn them over to a Chapter 7 trustee. And that litigation, it's now 4 years in, that continues to this day. Part of the problem, and Seth will speak to this, is that although there's supposed to be 17,000 units, because there's only 7,000, there's going to be litigation until the cows come home over whether a particular MSG is owned by Fund 1, Fund 2, Fund 7, Fund 8, Fund 35. Because, as Seth will explain, VIN numbers were casually passed from MSG to MSG for purposes of inspections. So, Seth, you want to reveal that, because it's kind of interesting.
Sure, and I should go backwards for a moment and emphasize that, as the slides indicate, literally several hours before our first day motion, I think what we forgot to say here is several hours before the first day motion hearing, the government filed civil forfeiture, actually criminal forfeiture in rem complaints against all of the assets. And that eliminated our ability. The judge would not go for some innocent purchaser, innocent borrower order. And so we actually began this case without a diploma. And so it created a burning candle effect and a lot of pressure on us to figure out what to do, and to do it very quickly. And eventually it led to approaching the investors to actually fund the case. And we're going to get to that in a moment. But the MSG equipment was built on trailers manufactured by third-party trailer companies. And the trailer manufacturer is just like a vehicle manufacturer. By law, the only party that's supposed to be able to apply a vehicle ID number onto a vehicle is the manufacturer. And so these things were primarily purchased by a single trailer company in Los Angeles who put on the appropriate VIN labels. We found out something later on that was pretty interesting. But at some point when Karpov realized the investors couldn't tell one unit from another, and he hadn't made enough to fill all the orders, something dawned on the people there to basically scrape off the original VIN labels that came from the manufacturer and put on counterfeit ones that they had printed at a local printer up here in the East Bay of San Francisco. And well, you know, when you're the CRO and you're kind of digging around and you've been there a while, you want to look around kind of deeply and maybe try to find something that the FBI didn't find. And in fact, we did. And in a drawer in a credenza were boxes of locally printed VIN labels and basically a cardboard box with other VIN labels that had been scraped off. Why they weren't destroyed is another mystery. But we basically found the real smoking gun that confirmed that one of the practices had been to change the VIN labels. This with the absence of physical documents made it extremely difficult to figure out who owned of the units that were actually manufactured, which investment fund owned which MSG, because they didn't have the original VIN labels on them anymore for the most part. In one of the due diligence trips to Las Vegas, you have to imagine there were so many of these MSGs that weren't rented, they had to be stored in warehouses. And we went to Las Vegas and I was protected by local counsel. And we went into the warehouse and you could see the marks where the vehicle ID number labels had been scraped off. And that pretty much, you know, I had to report that to Van and the legal team and Wyatt. And that was really one of the key moments where we understood fully that there was a fraud here.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions and then we are running short on time. So let me just address these questions and then Wyatt, I'll give you an opportunity to give any sort of closing impressions that you have. One question is, if there were significantly fewer MSGs than there were supposed to be, didn't that put the tax credits at risk? Absolutely.
Mhm.
And in fact, that's what, you know, early on in the case, some of these large institutions began to reverse their financial reporting and take impairments against those reverse the credits that they had already taken. I think that was part of the reason why they weren't willing to grant funding. I think there was a herding cats element to it. There were literally a dozen or so different companies. But the other element was they had already taken the financial hit and they were reluctant to write a check. One of the sort of creative options that we presented to them, by the way, was we actually found a credit source that was willing to finance the victim fund, right? The government had seized $50 million in cash amongst the balance of $120 million worth of assets. That money was going to flow back to the investors someday. And so we actually found a lender that was willing to finance against that someday, which would have given us enough money to fund the case. Another question which goes to the core of some of the ethics issues is, how can we represent an entity that's fraudulent? Well, the fraud was committed against the investors. So in a sense, although DC Solar was complicit in the fraud was Solar Eclipse Fund attracting tax equity from these third-party investors. That was in the past. Nothing we were doing was fraudulent. Nothing we participated in was fraudulent. And that was really important to us. Again, our client was telling us that there was a business, and with Wyatt's experience and Seth's experience, we believed, and we were getting inbound. We're getting inbound offers for financing. We're getting inbound offers to lease units from entities that were legitimate and were represented by counsel that we knew well, not sort of Karpov puppets, if you will. And they were coming to us with legitimate business opportunities that we thought we could exploit in the context of Chapter 11. When we discovered, in fact, it was a fraud, that's when we determined to go to the government as well as the investors. We had confidentiality agreements with everybody, but they were an important stakeholder in our case. And we thought that they were a logical suspect for financing the case, and the case would have been for their direct benefit. When they neglected to do so, that's when we sort of hung it up. And we sort of threatened conversion early on, I think in so the case was filed the first week of February. I would say towards the end of February. We didn't ultimately pull the trigger until first week to the middle of March. We gave a number of opportunities for people to sort of change their mind or get their head wrapped around the question of continuing the case. It wasn't sort of immediate, but we did act with urgency because you can't run a case for free, as everybody knows. But Wyatt, you want to offer some final impressions?
Yeah, I think a couple things that I wanted to add is and it probably doesn't fully reflect it in this. This was a fairly compressed time frame, and so the time between Seth finding that this was truly a fraud and the time we ended up, in front of the court and sitting side or next to the FBI was a fairly short period of time, and so there was still a lot of moving pieces we were trying to put together. And so it wasn't as though we suddenly we knew it was a fraud and then months later we kind of showed up and said, hey, let's try to figure this out. It was you're talking about a week to 10 days. The second part of that, I thought was pretty, as an independent director, which became a little unsettling, is right around the same time we were trying to figure out how much that it costs to actually manufacture one of these things. And as Van had pointed out, the tax equity would put in $50,000 and then there'd be a note. Well, we figured out it cost less than that $50,000. So the Karpovs didn't care about the note. They were literally making money. It was heads they win, tails they win, as long as this thing going. And once we've coupled that along with the issue with the VIN numbers, as a director, I sat back and I go, I can't, this is getting to be incredibly uncomfortable. We did have a plan that Seth and I had concocted prior to figuring out there was a fraud where we can get these back into the market and try to preserve the tax credits. But at the end of the day, when we saw, particularly with the VIN numbers missing, we looked at each other and said, look, how in the world is this going to, company A, company B, and company C are all going to claim this, and someone's going to end up losing. So there's going to be no winner in this situation. We tried to sit down with the federal government and say, look, if you kind of give us some flexibility, we can, with the benefit of time, we can actually help the proverbial victims who you are basically, by seizing all the assets, you're actually forcing them to realize their losses. And so that became a conversation with them. And they ultimately said, look, yeah, they're the victims, but, we're more concerned about federal crimes and the prevention of Ponzi schemes than we are really worried about whether Berkshire or East West Bank or Sherwin-Williams loses money. That really isn't our concern at this point in time. So couple all that together and we kind of made the decision, look, it's time to go. So, and the fact that they gave us no more assets to really attach to. So we said that it was time to convert.
Yeah, it was actually surprising to us. We thought that using the real estate as a means to fund the case was going to appeal to the government because the government, didn't seize the real estate initially, and we presumed, and they didn't deny it, that they just, the government was not in the property management business, so they really didn't want to manage all those properties. But when we showed up with an actual bona fide third-party offer for $10 million of financing based on that real estate, that's, as Seth pointed out, they commenced the forfeiture action, which pretty much put the nail in the coffin of using that real estate as collateral. So I don't know what the.
I want to just make the problem with an in-rem situation like this is that the liens don't begin on the date of the in-rem forfeiture filing. The government essentially owns those properties as of the date of the crime. And so that was really the key issue in not being able to get some kind of innocent buyer type ruling.
Yeah, and our judge, there is case law that supports the notion so that the automatic stay can not only be extended to beings and entities that aren't debtors, but the automatic stay can also be extended to things that the automatic stay doesn't protect against, like police power action. Our judge was unwilling to do that, and so as the slides point out, we offered 3 different alternatives to the investors to control their own destiny. They preferred to work with the Chapter 7 trustee ultimately. and they still are.
And
So-
fast forward, the government has not distributed any of the cash that it seized back in 2018, and it continues to hold all of the physical documents that they seized.
Yep, that's well said.
Van, who was the judge? Who was
Judge-
the judge on this one? Remind me.
Yeah, Judge Beasley in Reno was our judge. And he's no longer a judge, as I understand. He's retired. But Scott, I don't know what the protocol is, but I want to thank everybody for our time. We're sort of overextend our time. We could talk about this for hours, and we'd all be delighted to share more war stories about this. It was one of the more interesting things. It didn't turn out how we liked, but it was definitely something interesting to work on.
Well, thank you very much.
But I'd have yours.
Thank you very much, Van and Seth and Wyatt, for a great panel and great program and a great story. And that will conclude our program for today. Thank you.
Before everybody leaves us, if you have logged in not with your correct name that you registered with, I'm going to need you to put in the chat the name so I can account for you attendance-wise for your MCLE credit. There's a couple of people who I cannot recognize their names. Okay, and with that, I will stop.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie.